We're live. Welcome to Roberts.
Good to be here, Lorenz.
So I'm excited to talk to you today, explore a little bit of your experience bringing people together online. I was just looking at the Now What website, and the subtext is the art of being fully human in a time of crisis. And thought we'd start there, maybe unpack that a little bit.
Yeah, it's a phrase that just kind of emerged from the core group of people that had gathered for the first full edition of Now What, which was in the summer of 2019, and as a sort of a way to answer the question, what were we doing? What was the underlying energy? And it stuck. Every now and then, people wonder if we should say something different or have a more targeted theme to the gatherings than that. And so far, seven editions in, that tagline is still there. I think the time of crisis part is pretty central to it, and it sets us up as sort of a space where people can come to have conversations they don't always feel like they can have in other contexts in their lives, where either for one reason or another, we don't talk about how concerned we are about the future. It's whether it's denial or just it's not polite, or you don't want to bring people down, or there's nothing we can do about it, so why bring it up? I mean, there's a million different reasons, I think, why in mainstream circles that hasn't been as much of a conversation. I think since 2019 that's shifted, though. I think the mainstream dialogue is very much about how we're in a time of crisis now.
A lot has changed since 2019.
It has, right? And it was funny
because a whole different world
would come around, and it's like, wow, this time of crisis thing has a new resonance now.
Yeah.
That kept happening. Yes, indeed.
So so a lot here to dig into, but maybe just briefly, the art of being human. What is that for you?
Showing up as our whole selves, I think that's part of the idea. It's the art of being fully human. So I think, again, just as we sometimes compartmentalize our conversations and feel like it's not appropriate in certain spaces to talk about certain things, it's also often not appropriate to show up in certain ways. And so being fully human says, all of those parts of us, the grieving parts, the angry parts, the parts that want to party, the parts that don't have a clue what the hell we should do and are freaked out. Not just the parts that have a plan and want to share it and get people on board for doing good things. That all of that's welcome. I think that's part of it. And also to say that these times of crisis challenge our humanity. And some, as we can see, in many cases, they're bringing out the worst in us.
In some way, it's like easy to be human when everything's all good. I mean, whatever, that maybe not, but we don't realize it. And then
I think it's true. Yeah, in the way that we're wired for collaboration, for example, versus competition. I think biologists, anthropologists are pretty solid on that being true. It's not, and when we live, under constant fear and threat, other things come out. Those are part of us too.
And I think what also stands out for me is the where you just started around the conversational aspect. Is that's a big part of humanizing the human condition, creating spaces to be together in particular ways and new ways to practice being together, to feel heard, to really hear another person. That is a big part of this art of being fully human. And I think it's almost like the one word that comes up that could be added there is like practice, the art and practice of being fully human.
Yeah, well, certainly Now What and all of my work actually since 2010 has been focused on participation, on practice, and particularly on dialogue, conversation, as something that we need more of. We need more spaces for it, more diverse spaces for it. And we have these amazing new capacities, virtually to do it now. And so how do we step into those possibilities, from the space of our highest selves, as being fully human, in this crucial time? That's been, a core journey and inquiry for me, and place of practice for a dozen years now.
So tell me a little bit about, related to Now What, specifically, maybe a little more about the intention of Now What. I mean, we kind of gave the subtext there, but, what's the intention, and a little bit about the structure, like the actual, what is it?
Yeah. I don't know if screen sharing would make sense to make that more visual for people too. But it's modeled on, to some degree, on the process of open space technology, where a group gets together and builds the agenda themselves on the fly, or at the beginning of a gathering, and then meets at the end to kind of memorialize that. What did we learn? There are notes taken, but the idea is that you have a calling question, you have a focus, but you bring the whole system into the room, and that system creates the content, the flow. And so in the case of Now What, we don't open it wide to everybody who shows up as a participant, but we do have a core group of people we call the Now What collective, who have the authority to call sessions. And we have spaces that are open, the cafe spaces, where anybody could come in and say, I want to talk about this or that, and we support that. But the basic idea is that it's an open space for people who care about this idea of the art and practice of being fully human in time of crisis, to offer opportunities for engagement around that. And it's run the gamut from kind of very personal spaces for self-exploration to more outwardly targeted, action around a particular task or need, or and learning opportunities. Also, we've done different, a variety of different things. And it also, part of the underlying theory too was to say, in terms of what it's about, that we want to be this pop-up event twice a year that's in service to all the different things that are happening in the domain of call it systemic transformation, or the efforts to bring forth the more beautiful world our hearts know is possible. And in Charles Eisenstein's words, he was certainly an influence for a lot of us at the time that Now What was organized. And so rather than being a new thing that pulls energy into it, and the challenge was to show up in service to what's already happening. Initially, it was conferences, in-person conferences. Yes, those used to happen. And you couldn't go to all of them, right? So the first full edition of Now What, there were 5 conferences all happening around May, June, July 2019. And we had people at them, and then participating in Now What, and we're knitting together the ideas from them. But pretty soon we realized, even before in-person conferences stopped happening, that was just one dimension of all the stuff that's going on. You also had networks and organizations, and they all had their different events and conversation spaces online, and in-person gatherings, and that we could show up as a sort of a mycelial, cross-pollinating information and resource sharing kind of an offering to this whole kind of movement of movements and network of networks. So that's been the philosophy and the approach. And
So you got 7 cohorts or 7 iterations now?
Yeah, not counting the first thing we called Now What in March of 2019. That was just a follow-up to one particular conference in British Columbia. But after that, the full editions had much more kind of open context for people to come in, and they lasted anywhere from 4 weeks to 2 months. Most of them been about 6 weeks.
And so I want question I want to ask is like, how well has it worked? You know, this vision of the mycelium between like these events and things like that. Like, so is as far as, I mean, I'll speak for myself. You know, I'm my own harshest critic in a lot of ways, and so in some ways, like the events are great, and then to like my inspiration or aspiration, then it's like, oh, not quite there. So I'm curious in that dimension of just like your assessment as far as just you know you're bringing people together with this inspiration to create more connections. So no matter what, like you get the gold star, and then there's the kind of like internal vision or aspiration for it. And yeah, I'm curious about kind of like those two dimensions of how well it's worked.
Sure. So we absolutely have succeeded in bringing lots of people together, and I think connecting them up mycelium like to lots of different things in the forest of initiatives and networks for systemic transformation that we've plugged into the roots of different stuff there. And it's become a really important thing for a small group of people who develop some pretty tight relationships. It's also been a really valuable place for experimentation, a kind of an incubator or a place for action, research, and learning. So a number of people, prototype different forms of online gathering, for example, and different processes they wanted to use, and those things kind of then went off on their own as their own offerings, but they got tested out first in Now What, or people just got used to and skilled at holding space virtually, because a lot of what Now What has been is Zoom calls. So a lot of people got a lot of experience doing that, and just in time for COVID to come along. I think. Well, anyway, so that's
the first Now What was before COVID, right?
Oh yeah, we were already 2 years in by the time, right?
Mm-hmm.
Or maybe it was we had the June, July 2019 fall in the northern hemisphere 2019, and then it was spring 2020, right? Is that when COVID landed? So I guess that our third full one was the beginning of COVID. Yeah. And it was, we started early that year. We started in maybe late March, early April. So it was just as that was all happening, and the timing was really quite good for, I mean, in a typical Now What gathering, there might be 150 Zoom calls over 6 weeks, all different kinds, some of them on a weekly cycle or, clustered around different themes, other than kind of one-off. Some of them might be what we call field trips, where we just put, some other group's got an event on their calendar, and we say, hey, we're going to go visit them and support their activity. There's a whole bunch of that kind of stuff. So yeah, there's a lot just in Zoom world. We've also tried and to incorporate asynchronous conversation spaces, other kinds of online asynchronous tools for engagement and in-person engagement into the mix. And I'd say that's an area where the vision for doing that really well, kind of integrating all three of those domains, in-person, live, virtual, asynchronous, virtual, into this kind of complex symphony of engagement. We haven't pulled that off, but I keep dreaming and trying and declaring that it's possible, and we've seen some signs of that too, for sure. And there've always been at least some of those elements cooking in any given iteration.
I guess it kind of just speaks to this question of community and the sense of like a community as being a group of people that is continually in touch and continually sharing knowledge and resources, rather than just like, in a 6-week period twice a year or something like that. And I guess that's kind of what an asynchronous environment might offer. And that might be, I mean, certainly from my perspective, is often like a big aspiration, but can kind of also be a little bit elusive. Wondering about your thoughts about the broader sense of your experience building a community or what that means to you.
Right. Yeah, community has been a really important through line in my work, and it was a real design, important design question with Now What. Is this something that just pops up twice a year, and what does that mean for our capacity to support the emergence of community. Are we just showing up kind of in service to existing communities? Are we developing a community of our own? How does it sustain if we've got these gaps when we aren't getting together? I think what happened organically really is that because we've been doing this on a consistent rhythm, people do keep showing up, but they also care as we get closer to each iteration, about the next one. So the collective is meeting more than just during the gatherings, and developing relationships that way. And then people are also just kind of doing stuff together, and including even using our calendar to keep sharing things. So in some ways, even though the official gatherings only last these explicit periods of time, now what space is always open, and something is always or could always happen within it. So there have been other, anyway.
No, go ahead.
No, I was going to say, in other contexts, my work has maybe been more explicitly focused on nurturing an ongoing community. I mean, that is true with other things I've done, but I don't know. I think the other thing that comes to mind around that is a particular process that became really central to bringing a sense of community to the Now What Collective, that I've also used in many other contexts, and that informed Now What's design and philosophy from the beginning, even though we didn't make it explicit. And that process is what's known as the 6 conversations methodology or approach or framework that was developed by Peter Block. He was kind of a famous consultant in the corporate world originally, but then he kind of got somewhat disillusioned with that and decided that community and associational life, citizens coming together around the things they care about, in particular around bringing forth a future distinct from the past, that was the only thing that could do that our institutions will follow maybe, but if we want real change, we have to do it in this organic community, peer-to-peer kind of a way. So I love the conversations that he laid out in his book Community, the Structure of Belonging.
Peter, is that the one? I think that's the one where he references the work of Werner Erhard. Peter really got me into Werner's work.
He's very interested in Werner, and he does. He's a friend of his. So yes, that shows up in there to some extent, as well as a whole bunch of other influences. He's really nice in the book, and it has a whole initial section on what are the kind of this set of a dozen or more core insights that inform the approach, and that's one of them. But he's got large group conversation methodologies like Open Space and World Cafe are listed. Christopher Alexander's concept of pattern languages and creating spaces of aliveness was an influence. The guy who wrote Bowling Alone, this idea that our communities have fragmented, and we've now outsourced all the things we used to do for ourselves to institutions and the market, and how things like safety and health and education and all that was much more something we took charge of ourselves in our neighborhoods, in our communities, and so much of that's been lost. So anyway, he has a whole list of influences, but he also has in this very specific kind of recipe for a set of conversations, he says embody patterns of a culture of restoration that kind of replace the business as usual patterns, the culture of retribution, he calls it, corresponds to patriarchy and power over versus, partnership and power with, a decolonized mindset versus a colonial imperial mindset. And I think that's what I love about the conversations is that they really emphasize this shift in what we focus on. For example, from mandate and selling and persuasion to invitation and the free choice to say no, and that being fine. And but also to having real conversations about commitment and treating commitment as something we that comes from the heart. That's a sacred promise as opposed to an exchange, a barter. Oh, yes, I'm doing this, but I'm only really doing it because you're doing this for me. That kind of transactional mindset is how we built the world we have. So if we want a different world, we need to follow different patterns. So we use those. We started using those within the Now What Collective. We started then offering them to Now What participants. In this last edition of Now What, I pulled together over 100 people to have these conversations. We even extended them beyond when Now What ended. So they ran for like 2 months. We mapped some of the participation and output from them. We organized all these different cohorts to participate in them, kind of saying, these conversations are useful for your community, for your network. You can come into this larger space with a cohort of your own folks and have it, around what you care
That's
about.
cool.
Right? So it's this idea of how do we show up in service to mycelium like to the forest, right? So we were testing that out too, that's continues to be a very.
So what are the 6 conversations? Is that something you can summarize briefly?
Sure. So I mentioned invitation. That's the first one, and the only one that has to come in a particular order because it's what gathers the group, and that's done in as personal way as possible.
So invitation is in like, why are we here?
Well, it's to say, here's a possibility for a future distinct from the past that I'm inspired by, or some small group of us that's inviting you is inspired by. And if you're inspired by that too, here's what we're asking of you. There's always something that's asked, and we'd love to have you be a part of this, this community, of this group, of this project, of this initiative. The context can vary in terms of exactly what you're coming together to do. Or you could come into an existing community and say, we're using this process to bring forth this possibility for ourselves.
And so you'll offer something like this, and then depending on the group size, have people go out into breakouts, or how does that? What is the actual structure of the process?
So the invitation is, basically however you can invite people is good, but ideally you do it one-on-one. If you can do it in person, you do that. That the act of inviting is one of the core practices of a culture of restoration, of welcoming people in, but not selling them, not twisting their arms, right? So that they only say yes if they really are called to what you're gathering for. Once you've got the group gathered, then you have the rest of the conversations. And if you're true to the process, you have them all because they synergize, and they are a whole set. Typically, and they happen primarily in small groups. So you break up the large group, whether you're in person or virtual, into small groups, typically groups of 3, to have the actual conversations, which are each framed around a particular question. And there's a set of questions for all 5 of the other conversations, which are possibility. The distinction there is with problem solving, by the way, that possibilities for a future we want, as opposed to fixing the problems of the past, which is limiting and traps us in all kinds of ways. Not that it's bad. I mean, none of these things are bad, but we need to give more room to voice to the new patterns. So possibility, dissent, and the distinction there is with lip service. Dissent is about expressing doubts and concerns, and also about saying no. And the distinction would be, well, there's all kinds of inauthentic forms of dissent as well, but authentic dissent has an absence of blame. There's kind of ownership implied in it, and it's real. It's not performative. Although I guess I'm also thinking of its twin, which is commitment. So that's the saying yes. The idea is your yes has no meaning if you can't also say no. And there also lip service comes in, that we often say yes and we don't really mean it, and we're just trying to look good, as well as barter, that I'm only saying yes because I'm getting something in return. And so we try to move past those distinctions in commitment and dissent kind of as a pair. Then you've got ownership, which says that and there the distinction is with blame. So the idea is everyone in this room, everyone in this community is invited in as a co-owner and has an influence, has say, has some kind of authority, has a choice to make about their stance as an owner, which could be I'm just visiting and I don't really feel like I am, but at least declaring that. And this, the pattern it's meant to replace is one where it's always somebody else's problem. This is somebody else's room. If I don't like what's happening in here, my only choice is to leave and say, well, it was the fault of that guy, who was leading things that it didn't go the way I want. And of course, you can fractally expand that out to pretty much everything happening on the planet. And then gifts is the other often missing conversation. and the distinctions with deficiencies. We're so focused on, what we did wrong, what we need to improve, what we're missing, versus what we can build on that's going well, and what we appreciate and what we're grateful for, and what, most importantly, what we have to offer that somehow we haven't managed to give yet. That really is our greatest, perhaps, gift to the future we want to bring forth. That corresponds to living into our destiny. So of course we'd rather not talk about that and just talk about what's missing and what's wrong, because it lets us off the hook. But interestingly, there's a gentleness to the conversations, because it separates these things out too. So like often if you talk about possibility and here's this inspiring thing, then the next thing is, well, how are you going to make that happen? Right? What 5 commitments you're going to make to do that? And that becomes a burden. That shuts the space down. Right? Peter Block says the question, what are you going to do about that? He calls the cruelest question. And it's not that it isn't important that we do things about stuff, but forcing that, as opposed to letting that come from our hearts, in due course. That's key. The same with dissent. It's complete in its expression. You get to say, I'm really concerned about this, without proposing how we fix it. There's an actual rule in that conversation against fixing. In fact, in all the conversations, there's a rule against giving any kind of advice or being helpful, unless it's something really, really obvious, like, the nearest grocery store. But advice giving is seen as something that undermines relatedness and takes people out of their stance of ownership, or the potential for them to claim one.
What I love about this is, about the advice giving specifically, is also just that, there's so few spaces where people can talk and feel heard for whatever they're saying, without a question like, okay, what are you going to do about it? Or like, oh, here's what you should do about it. And just that in itself is healing and transformative. And then the other side, I think, of what the value of a conversational process is really about awareness building, that through conversation, through a particular conversation, like that kind of conversation, I can discover things. I guess the word for me is discovery. Like, I feel like it's so key to this kind of conversational process, is that you really create an opportunity for people to discover for themselves rather than to be told. And that a lot of that discovery happens specifically through conversation, specifically through kind of seeing something mirrored or reflected or expressed by someone else in a particular way, that you kind of have this like aha moment, and you get to discover something for yourself. And then then you get to express that discovery, and someone else gets to discover something, and that creates a completely different energetic experience around the whole thing.
Yeah. I mean, Block in a way defines the communal space as the space where we come together to do things together that we can't do on our own. And I think part of that sort of synergistic discovery process is that he also talks about the importance of this quality of aliveness in the room, that the room, when you're having this conversation, is an experience of the transformed future we want, right there, tangible. And I get that, the equivalent of that feedback over and over again when I do these conversations with people, just how not just how quickly they drop into an authentic space of relationship, but the kinds of things that they talk about, the kinds of insight that emerge for them, and how different it is from the normal conversations they would have.
So what have you learned, like, over the last 7 iterations of doing Now What specifically, and, really creating an invitation and an opportunity for these kind of conversations? I mean, what are some of the top level, like, meaningful insights you've had about what works, what doesn't, like adjustments you've made, what's emerged for you in the process?
It still feels so much like a work in progress.
And of course it is. But you mean 7 iterations in? I mean, I know, like, we run our TTO, and we're about to go into our 8th iteration, and every single iteration, at least for me, I can't speak for you, but so I'm asking from my point of experience, but for me, every single iteration is like a schooling, because each one is a new prototype, and each one involves adjustments and and shifts and kind of involves like a process of inquiry and around like, does this work? Does this work? Like what? Yeah.
It's been a really powerful validation, I think, of the importance of having these kinds of spaces for connecting with each other, for building relationships, for dialogue, the value of the openness of the invitation rather than trying to manage and control and design what each gathering will focus on, letting that emerge from a collective. And it's been a validation of the 6 conversations process and sort of that whole, not just the conversations in their sort of facilitated form, but as a way of being. And then I've taken things from that and applied them in other contexts. I mean, I've been doing other things that evolved, informed what was before that came along too, 7 years of work before that. But and then there've been all kinds of just more practical, technical things, certain, like the calendar that we use, the team up calendar, has become a favorite of mine, and I've introduced other people to it, and I use it in lots of other contexts. I just think when you want to empower a group or network to put a calendar together that's complex, and give different levels of permission for access and changing things and stuff, it's a really nice tool. And just as one example, there's other things like that, I suppose. What else?
So when you're running these conversations, you're obviously not present for all of them.
No.
Okay. And is there any kind of like process structure, or do people just come together and have the conversation?
Well, each session, as in open space, whoever calls that session is responsible for its process, its facilitation, or the lack thereof. So it runs the gamut.
Do you offer any guidelines for that, or is it kind of freestyle?
Well, sometimes we collaborate. People say they want support in doing something, and so a little team will form to do that. And sometimes I'm a part of those. Sometimes other people. So that certainly happens. But no, we don't have some kind of overall set of guidelines or suggestions or rules on that. I'm thinking back to the learning, and I guess maybe when I said it's a work in progress, maybe some of the things I've learned are just how hard certain things actually are. Maybe is a learning, how hard it is to break out beyond a certain size and scale in this kind of work, or and maintain, particularly if you're committed to maintaining a certain kind of level of relatedness and connection, and not going into sort of selling and broadcast. If you're really living into invitation rather than selling and persuasion, and you're actually asking something of people if they show up, you get a smaller group, and learning to live with that and see the beauty in that. Peter Block talks about how he'd much rather be in a group of 5 people that really care about what we're there for than a group of 100 that have one foot out the door or just there to look good, or distracted most of the time. So there's that, as well as this idea of having things work across all those different dimensions of gathering, in person, live, virtual, and asynchronous. And asynchronous is this whole jungle, really, of all kinds of different tools and platforms and different purposes, right? And so how to integrate like that jungle, not just that as one thing, to me, just it's really hard. But I still think there's something there's some value in that vision, and I keep working on it. Anyway,
I wouldn't know anything about that.
Well, Sutra has been was from fairly early on, has been one of the platforms that we thought was just had a ton to offer and was different from others in many ways, and it's always had a little bit of something going on in each Now What edition. But I guess that's another learning, that for all of these, particularly in the realm of convening and bringing people together for participatory process, you need at least one person, if not a group, that's really taking ownership for that invitation process and putting work into it. It's not going to just happen, especially now that everyone's gotten used to virtual engagement, and there just is literally an infinite number of opportunities to engage if you go looking for them. So that idea of personal invitation in particular, or creating a really compelling possibility to gather around that needs somebody energizing it. And it makes the difference between 100 plus people showing up for my round of the 6 conversations as part of the last Now What. Not just mine. I had colleagues, as I said, but and something else someone offered where maybe 1 or 2 people showed up per session, or maybe nobody sometimes. Well, that rarely happens.
I mean, this is such a rich territory, also just to kind of create the connection between Peter Block's work and Werner Erhard's work that's had a big influence on us. And of course, Werner Erhard is the progenitor of Landmark. And of course, Landmark, is all about, I don't know how familiar you are with their work, but, it's all about enrollment and registration, which is all about communication. And, people have different relationships to the Landmark energy, but what the biggest thing that I got out of it was just about, how you create an invitation in a way that matters, that is meaningful to the other person, that really creates the bridge between what's important to you and what's important to them. And it's a way to kind of navigate this territory of what people call persuasion, which I find, to be so off-putting, the kind of the whole world of online selling and like banging you over the head with some kind of like offer. But I think the alternative to that, and really the only alternative, is if you want to attract people to your offering, especially if it's something related to livelihood, is to become an extremely good communicator. And I think that's also something that's like prototyped and tested. And how do you create the invitation in a way that really resonates with a person?
Yeah, that's certainly true. The vision with Now What was that lots and lots of us would be doing that invitation work.
Well, that's a conversation right
30
there.
people in the collective, each invited 10 people personally. 8 of them said yes.
So this is so fascinating, right? Because we're talking about like this structure of co-participation, co-responsibility, and there's this like vision of like co-creation, that like we're going to create this thing together, and people are going to take equal ownership of kind of carrying it. And I feel like that's something that for me is, I guess, is just the person who's often convening and kind of working along those threads, is, if I'm being totally honest, as a territory, I have to kind of like manage my expectations and make sure I don't get jaded. And so I'm always kind of like tracking that. But I guess where I always land on is that ultimately where I'm always like prototyping and iterating into is the structure of the, I don't know, for lack of a better word, of the organism, that somehow like the structure of whatever it is has to elicit and evoke that. And it's, for me, it's a little bit like, the mythical unicorn or something, because like you said, like, the aspiration is that's, that if everybody in the thing invited and brought in 10 people, then it would be a different thing, right? And so I guess, why do you think that isn't happening?
I think it does happen in many contexts, including aspects of Now What. But the other thing in Now What is that people may invite folks into their piece of it, not to the rest of the gathering. So that's another part of just the complexity of that particular approach. So, if you really want a lot of people to show up for a thing, that's a different game than saying we want a whole community to form and show up consistently for a whole bunch of things. And that's much harder and I don't think it can be forced. And even good communication, in the end, it's about just sort of the life energy something's generating, I think. I don't know. I think that's an area where what we find with each of the editions of Now What is that for those of us that did show up, we feel great about what we experienced and what we received. And while we might have this vision of something that was bigger and had more money flowing through it and all kinds of other things that, people got onto this platform and used this tool or whatever, that didn't happen, we still know that at its core level of just giving us a place to practice the art of being fully human in time of crisis, it did that for us, and that's really enough. We don't have to be, everything to everybody. If your livelihood depends on it, that shifts things, and I think that's been that's made it easier for now. No one's livelihood depends on it. Although part of the vision was that people's livelihoods could be supported by it. And one of the disappointments is that we haven't gotten to that level, that it could be a place, for example, where people that want to be network weavers in service to systemic transformation could just come and actually, receive financial support for doing that work, because it really is an opportunity to weave in that way. That's quite beautiful. Or to facilitate, if you love facilitating dialogue, that it's a great space to come in and do that. And that's also a hard gig to get paid for in a lot of ways, and stuff like that. So, I don't have final answers to that, but I'm not.
It's complex, I mean, I just, and I really resonate with what you said, that what's there is enough. This work is so complex on so many levels around. I guess one of the earliest things I kind of figured out, when I was first kind of enamored with this idea of co-creation, I kind of, after a while, I realized that most people don't know what that means. Don't like, because co-creation isn't like a conceptual thing. It's a way of being, and I think it's a way of being that we're all learning how we're like living into. Like, what does it mean for Ben Roberts and Lorenz Sell to co-create? Right. That's something that's like, there are so many layers to what that can mean, and in some ways we have co-created. Like, I've held a session on your thing. You've used Sutra. But then there's so many dimensions to that, and that's just between two nodes, and when we try to extend that into 10 nodes or 100 nodes or 1,000 nodes, there's so many developmental dimensions and complexities around that. And so there's this kind of vision or aspiration behind what it could mean as far as this beautiful world that our hearts know is possible. And then there's the reality of kind of bridging the world that is as it is, and the requirements that they're there. Many of which are financial, livelihood related, and then this aspiration and kind of prototyping and sensing into what's possible.
To me, I can connect that to the mycelial metaphor, and that the work at the mycelial level is very fine grained. It's just you and me strengthening our relationship and passing some information or some nutrients back and forth and out into the larger network without really having to be responsible for that. But then you have the mushrooms, right? That are the visible fruiting manifestation of the whole thing. And we really, want the mushrooms. They're exciting. They can feed us and blow our minds and maybe even poison our enemies. Infect them, or not. We can inoculate them with a new culture. And there's a mushroom I love called the lobster mushroom that actually takes over another mushroom and turns it into something completely different and actually quite delicious. That looks nothing like the one it attacks. Anyway, the mushrooms are sort of, they're unpredictable. Some years you get them, some years you don't. They're sort of, when the system senses the conditions are right, boom, they pop up, and then they're an unstoppable force and often quite abundant. So that works for me as a story for lots of different things. The Occupy movement, for example, as a mushrooming of stuff that continued to exist afterwards. And people said, "Oh, it failed." I'm like, it didn't fail. You have no idea, or you're just not thinking about it the right way. And in the case of Now What, I can point to certain things. Like one of perhaps my all-time favorite thing that happened was around Earth Day in 2020. Was it 2020? I think it was. It had to be. Where we didn't go into that edition of Now What with any thought that we were going to do anything for Earth Day. And we had something like a 3-week run up to it. But the idea, somebody dropped that seed in. Someone was reading Rachel Carson, silent spring, and was really inspired by that, and came up with this idea of a sonic spring, that we're going to celebrate sound on this Earth Day. And then, this guy came in who's into all kinds of interesting experiments with online radio stations and people collaboratively making music, virtually. We did this whole Earth Day celebration, and we did it for as long as it was Earth Day somewhere on the planet, which we learned was a 48-hour period. I didn't realize that. A single day is going on somewhere that day for 48 hours.
Oh,
That's how long it
interesting.
takes.
I didn't know that either.
Yeah. So talk about learning. So from the beginning of the day over in New Zealand, where things got started, to the sun setting in Hawaii on that day, and we were on the beach with Buddhist monks chanting while we watched the sunset, and a whole family of the monks who had never gotten on Zoom together before, and were there kind of chanting with him. It was sublime. Elizabeth Satoris joined us virtually. She wasn't on the beach, but thought leader hero of mine. And anyway, just as an example, but the other thing, the whole thing was amazing. And it all just kind of happened. It wasn't planned. And like the larger sort of open space approach, different people plugged in different things. So over the course of that 48 hours, there were 30 different things that happened. It was just completely magical and delightful. And it wasn't about creating an outcome. It was about being together and celebrating and trying things out, and having fun, and also being really serious about what was going on. It was kind of all, it was talk about an experience of aliveness, right? We had this 48-hour experience of aliveness and global interconnection that was just absolutely delightful.
Amazing. Yeah, Ben, I have so much respect for your work, just for your approach, and for me, a big part of like the answer to a lot of the things that we've been talking about as challenges or whatnot is exactly what you're doing, is just doing it, and kind of without an attachment necessarily, or holding that attachment lightly, to a particular outcome or size or whatever. But I think what is most called for right now in the world are these spaces that invite us to be human and to discover what that means, because that doesn't have an answer. And just to prototype, just to test, to bring people together. So really appreciate your on the ground effort and just all the wisdom you're sharing here today. Thanks for the conversation.
Yeah, thank you so much. My sense is that part of what I tell myself when things aren't at the scale that I want is, well, I'm not remotely alone in doing this, even if what I'm doing is sort of special and unique in some ways. You're doing it, and there are, at least dozens of people I know that are doing it, and probably millions of people around the world in their own different, unique ways, bringing us together around these sort of crucial need for connection and dialogue and in these times. So I trust that. I don't know if what's happening is enough, what that means, but it's certainly way bigger than me, and it can't be my job to do more than just what my part is.
Maybe we're all just mushrooms stemming from an invisible mycelium that we're not even aware of, but your little mushroom, my little mushroom.
Well, I think I'm aware that there's a lot of it, right? And I mean, just look at the network map that we created for Now What, and it looks like a pretty impressive mycelium all by itself, and it's only 800 people all kind of intertwined. But we know we're just a small fraction. So I think there's a billion of us playing this game. I can't measure that and tell. It doesn't seem at all unlikely.
Even if there isn't, there will be. Yeah. All right, Ben, thanks a lot for making some time, and just really appreciate the work you're doing, and just having an opportunity to geek out on this stuff with you.
My pleasure. Thanks, Lorenzo.